Hello, Dr. Mason here, and we're back for Unit 2 of our Contemporary World History course here at Waldorf Online. And this week I've got a trifecta of things for you to do. But first, let's talk a little bit about the first week. I thought we did a pretty good job across the board as a whole, especially on the discussion board. I know it's a little bit of a challenge that first week to bring in some specific evidence. I did see some of that very positively in your written work for the first week, where you're bringing in some good evidence to underwrite your analysis. But one of the things I think we can all strive to improve here is a lot of you are doing a really good job of making clear topic sentences and then kind of explaining your rationale. But what I want to see you is kind of taking the next step is to find meaningful evidence and then incorporate that into your analysis to really elevate it to the next level. And sometimes how that works is by adjusting scope and scale. Sometimes that's finding meaningful evidence, especially as we get into discussion board this week. I'll challenge you a little bit there, it'll also be really important on your assessment and essay that you're working on this week. So maybe we can talk through that a little bit as we get into the specifics. So the first thing you've got this week is taking a look at the Unit 2 discussion board. You're going to have to knock this out again by Saturday night at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we're going to be looking at a very macro kind of question. We're going to zoom way out and look at political, economic, and social cultural factors of the onset of World War I on this global scale. So there's all sorts of different things you could talk about that'll give you a chance to work this. So one of the ways I think about scope and scale is scope. I always think about like, maybe this is simplistic, I think about it like on a deer rifle. You know, you take a scope, you zoom in, and the further you zoom in, the more details you're going to see. And one of the ways you can adjust your scope in this question is by focusing on those political, economic, or social cultural factors. So when we think about the onset of World War I, people always talk about entangling alliances, bringing people in. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand kind of triggers all of these different political agreements between different European powers that bring them into this conflict with each other from these secret alliances they have. Those are certainly political factors you could talk about in there. You can see that in the text reading for the week. There's also economic factors that go into this that are going to have to do with countries controlling land and natural resources. That's always a motivator for conflict between countries, certainly something you look at as well. There's also social and cultural factors that bring different countries into the war. And as you look at each of those things and narrow your scope that way, it's going to allow you an opportunity to kind of get into some of those details. This is where I think we can take the next step forward in the course and really elevate how we're working on our responses, is to bring in some of that outside evidence. I don't want you to just go on some kind of tangent like you would maybe on a social media post about here's what I think and why, without bringing in any supporting evidence. In a class like this, I want you to be getting into the textbook, thinking about the question critically, and then identifying what you actually think is most responsible: political, economic, social, cultural factors, and then making a clear topic statement and supporting your point with evidence to develop your analysis. And if you do that, I think it can lead to a really good conversation that pairs your unique perspective with some of the other things that we're looking at as evidence from the textbook, from other sources, all of those kind of things on the discussion board. Again, you need to get the first post done by Saturday night at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then your response to a classmate, which really avoid, I saw some of this on the first discussion board, avoid just going like, that's a really good post, I think that's good. You'll lose a bunch of points if that's what you're doing. I need to see some quality conversation happening there that's bringing in some of this well-reasoned evidence and analysis. So that's due by Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. You have two other things to knock out this week. The first is a short assessment. It's just one question worth 100 points where it needs to be a minimum of 75 words. And minimum is the important there because what you're going to talk about in that question is what were the primary objectives of Woodrow Wilson, who's the American president, at the Versailles Peace Conference, and how do they differ from the post-war aims of other allied nations? So you can try to do this in 75 words. It's very difficult to bring in any kind of evidence in 75 words. That's usually a couple of sentences. So what I'm looking for when I go to grade this is how you're making a clear topic sentence and then supporting it with at least a couple of different pieces of evidence. So if you go in, and again, it's just kind of like you go on a short 75-word rant and you're trying to just get to 75 words and then you quit as soon as you get there, put a period, put it out there, you're not going to score very well, because what I'm looking for is that it's at least 75 words and then it answers both parts of that question. So first, you got to detail what Woodrow Wilson's primary objectives were at the Treaty of Versailles. You also need to talk about what the other Allied powers wanted to get out of those meetings, and how they were different. So that's at least kind of three different things you got to be considering and bringing in evidence to support there. So if you can get the discussion board done, you get that assessment done, also due Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. The other big thing you got to do this week is work on your Unit 2 essay. And this has pretty clear instructions, but I'll go through them a little bit here. So for this, you need to put 2 pages together, length, APA style, double-spaced, all those kind of things. But in this essay, I need you to answer 2 main questions. So what were the various stages in the rise of nationalist movements in Asia and the Middle East during the time period we're studying? So you'll see this in the textbook as you're going through, but I think it's always good to go into the text reading knowing what you need to get out of it. That way, if you're taking notes, which turns out taking notes towards the task that you're going to be asked to do, very critically important for success. And then how it can help guide what you're pulling out of there. So if you can identify what some of these national movements in Asia and the Middle East are doing during this time period, and then how did those experiences compare with national movements in 19th century Europe, if you can be paying attention to the geographic regions there, so you know you need to be paying attention to the Middle East, Asia, and European nationalist movements during this time period, and then know that you're going to have to make that comparison. So how you're going to get through the text reading, you should have a good broad idea. Then you're going to go in and work through the 5 questions that are listed there in the syllabus and schedule. So first one, I want you to choose one country from Asia and the Middle East at 1919 to 1939, and then gather details to begin your research. So you're going to have to narrow your scope down to one country in Asia or the Middle East. And the easiest way to do that is while you're reading through the textbook, find one that you think is most interesting. I always tell my students that history is super boring. If it's something you're not interested in, maybe you're not going to be interested in any. Doesn't matter, pick one. As you do that, find that one country, zero in, start to do your initial research, and then in step 2, choose one visual or print primary source that talks about that national movement from your selected country. So when you think about primary sources, we want to think about things created during the time period. So this could be a political cartoon from that time period. It could be a speech made by a nationalist leader. It could be a poster. It could be a painting. It could be a film clip. It could be an audio clip of a speech. It doesn't matter what kind of primary source. I want it to be from the time period and related to that nationalist movement in your specific country. So from your research findings, you'll move to step 3, where you'll choose 2 appropriate scholarly sources. The easiest way to do this is to go to the Waldorf online library and look for your topic there. Google Scholar is another popular option for this that many students use, but the important part of this is scholarly source. So if when I go to grade, I'm looking at the sources you pull in, it's like what we'd call a tertiary source, something written for a general audience, which would be things like National Geographic or Encyclopedia Britannica or, God forbid, Wikipedia. No, I mean, we want to make sure that we're thinking about expertise and how when you bring in expert sources, it raises your own level of credibility. So what I'll usually say is to think about scholarly secondary sources. First, it needs to be scholarly. So how can you ensure this? First, think about who wrote it and what their credentials are. If it's going to be a scholarly secondary source, most of the time, these are people that are experts in their field. This means they're not journalists. And we could go on all sorts of rants about journalists and how they kind of delve into. Think about how the person is somebody you want to listen to that has expertise related specifically to the topic. And then also think about who's publishing it and what their intended audience is. Scholarly sources are meant for us, people in an academic setting, whether that's academics like myself that are professional historians or other scholars, whether it's you as a student in a class that's trying to use academic sources. Be thinking about who the audience is. One of the best ways to tell this is to look at who's publishing. Look for an academic publisher. That's the easiest way to safeguard yourself here. Look for a university press or a scholarly publication that's able to further your analysis. And if you have questions on how to do that, make sure you're reaching out and communicating. So once you find that, once you've done your research, you've developed your analysis, now you can draw conclusions from the comparison and the range of opinions reflected in the research to form your own perspective. Use your research to compare the national movements in your chosen country to other national movements in 19th century Europe, and then prepare a thesis statement. Now, this sounds like a lot of steps, but it is going to be a great checklist to work through to make sure that you're putting yourself in a position to do quality research this week. So as you do this, make sure that you're offering your reader specific insight to what your stance is after doing the research. I always tell students that nobody cares about your opinion, but people do care about your analysis. So if you can work through this research process, if you go through the textbook, if you go find that primary source, if you work through the secondary sources, you now have, you're in a position to create meaningful analysis based around an argument, which is what I want to see you doing on this assignment this week. So use those guidelines, make sure you're putting your best foot forward there. And then also just make sure you're reaching out with whatever questions you have about this process. Again, the best way to get me is kevin.mason@waldorf.edu so I can sift through and hopefully give you a good response to whatever questions you might have, and we can put ourselves in a great position to be successful this week. I'm pretty happy with where we're at as a class so far, and I look forward to the great work you're going to do this week. Good luck.